I've been studying machine learning for the past 6 years, in which I worked as an ML student researcher for over 2 years and have written my first 3 papers. My journey started studying computer engineering, not knowing what ML was or even that it existed, to where I am now, soon joining my favorite AI startup as a research scientist. In this video, I'll be sharing my experience over these 6 years and explain what I did each year to get where I am now. Things like what to expect for the first few years, what I did to get my first ML student roles, and most importantly, what you should be avoiding. And trust me, there's a lot. Okay, before we get to years 1 and 2, how did I get into tech? Well, young Boris liked physics and math in high school and thought, with physics you can't really make money, so I need to do engineering, i.e. applied physics. Building a robot would be really cool. But then I also need to know how to program the robot to make it do the stuff I wanted to do. At that time, I didn't know AI and ML existed, but those were my thoughts. Those led me to studying computer engineering at the TU Berlin. The first 2 years were really tough, of course. I had to take the standard courses like Linear Algebra 1, Calculus 1 and 2, and a course on differential equations. Luckily, I genuinely enjoy learning math, but that doesn't mean it was easy for me. In the beginning, it all doesn't make much sense, and you don't know why you are learning all these mathematical formulas and abstract concepts. But I promise you, at some point, most of them will make sense and you will learn to appreciate and make use of them. Especially when learning ML. The basics of these math skills will be the fundamentals you will later need for ML and give you an intuition for how to look at ML models in a mathematical sense. But back then, again, I didn't even know AI existed. I had a lot of electrical engineering and even some physics courses. Those were more tough. But I also had my first computer science courses and learned how to code in C. Yes, in C. That's right. Remember, I was a computer engineering major, so my program was designed for low-level coding and electrical engineering. But I still had the standard courses on data structures and algorithms in Java, and also a course on theoretical computer science. All that is pretty much the standard things you learn when getting into computer science related programs. Some CS theory and a lot of coding. Luckily, coding is much easier nowadays with the cool coding assistants out there, a tool I cannot live without anymore. You have probably heard about GitHub Copilot, but what if you want to use a tool that has pretty much the same features, but you could use it for free as an individual? Well, that's where today's sponsor comes into play, Codium. You can very easily install it in any of your favorite IDEs and then simply hit Command+I and type in what you wanted to do. The cool thing is, it can not only refactor and explain existing code, but it also uses a lot of context from your entire project to figure out how to write the most appropriate functions using different APIs spread out throughout your code base. It looks at your open tabs and even the entire Git repo. You can even go beyond that and add links to other files and repos to use those as context as well. So to improve your coding efficiency, use Codium for free forever, using my link in the description below. No strings attached, just an amazing free product. But now let's get back to what I did besides normal college courses. Landing my first student researcher job at an optical physics lab about 6 months into my first year. I wanted to somehow boost my resume, earn some money to survive college, and also just learn more stuff. I then saw this listing at a research institute directly next to my uni and applied. It was honestly quite surprising that they invited me to an interview because I literally had not much to offer except basic programming skills. But I guess for the job I was supposed to do, it was enough. I was responsible for running a lot of experiments with optical fibers and doing measurements. When starting a new job or project, the learning curve will likely be very steep, which is amazing. I learned a lot. But if you do the same measurements for over 1.5 years, the learning curve plateaus and the job becomes boring. In total, I stayed at this job for 3 years, and this learning curve was completely flat after perhaps 8 to 9 months, if not less, and this was a big mistake. I really should have at least changed to a different team at this research institute after a year. But I was quite exhausted for these first 2 years. I slept 6 hours a night, didn't do much sports, and just worked a lot. Which is normal. I don't want to complain. I had a lot of fun. In fact, I am happy and proud I did all that. But yeah, all of this happened in my first 2 years of uni. Most importantly, I learned the basics of math and computer science, and worked as a student researcher, all of which helped me with studying machine learning, without even knowing ML existed. I finally got into the third year, semesters 5 and 6, where I could choose some of my courses myself. This 5th semester is where I saw that AI courses existed at my uni, and is where I chose my very first AI course. This is where the ML journey really started. That said, this AI course was split into 2 parts. The first one was about old school AI, not machine learning. Yes, AI does not necessarily mean ML. If you have an algorithm with a set of rules to make decisions, it's effectively AI. I learned about things like the strips method. Looking back, it's not that exciting, honestly, but that is where I started. And back then, I thought it was decently cool. But the second half of this course was really cool. The second half was about reinforcement learning, which in retrospect is a weird start into ML, learning about RL before even knowing what a neural network was. But maybe this is a good way to show you that it does not really matter how you start. If you keep going, you will learn all the fundamentals anyway, just in a different order perhaps. But I would still not recommend it if you have the option to choose, but you get the point. Anyway, I learned about things like bandit theory, Monte Carlo tree search, Markov decision processes, and finally, RL algorithms like Q-learning. So in my 5th semester, 2.5 years into college, there was still not that much ML. But these RL lectures really got me interested in ML and especially RL. That's why I wanted to do my bachelor thesis in RL, which is what I did in my 6th semester. I worked on deep reinforcement learning for autonomous robotic navigation. This was a complete cold start into deep learning. I didn't even know what a neural network was. I had to learn all of that on my own through YouTube videos. Even worse, in the beginning, I struggled a lot to even get the hardware set up. And when I reached out to my supervisor for help, he said he thought I might not be ready for this thesis, and I had 2 weeks to prove him otherwise. And if I failed, he would have to drop the thesis with me. Which would have been so bad. The semester had already started, and then I would have to look for a completely new one. But I pushed through and made it. This thesis project was a lot of work, a lot of engineering work, and no real training itself, since the thesis was more on the deployment side of DRL agents than the training side. Nevertheless, I still learned a lot of core coding skills, like debugging, and did get to learn PyTorch for the first time. So my final bachelor year was still a slow step into the world of ML, but a very firm one that set the path to going all in on ML, which is why I then switched to a pure computer science master. So my 4th year began and I went all in on ML. I selected only ML courses and projects. But this of course came with a lot of challenges. In my first graduate semester, I pretty much had one big course and one big project. For the project, I continued to work on the same team for autonomous robotic navigation that I worked with during my bachelor thesis. The project was still more of an engineering effort because we built a benchmarking suite for autonomous robots, which again came with a lot of failing and debugging. But this time, I could focus a lot more on training our own agents using PyTorch and had to start reading papers to learn things like PPO. Of course, the beginning of reading papers is always a bit tough, because you have to get used to the lingo. But I felt so cool, I felt like a real scientist. The really cool thing was that later that year, we actually published this work to one of the 2 best robotics conferences, IROS. That was so huge for me. It was my first ML paper, and it was even published at a top conference. Now, alongside this project, I had my first real ML course. I learned all the basics of classical machine learning. For example, what is supervised learning, unsupervised learning? What is the bias-variance trade-off? What are methods like linear regression, decision trees, support vector machines, k-means, PCA, boosting, and ensemble learning? And I learned about all the basics of neural networks, like what loss functions, gradient descent, backpropagation, and regularization are. Alongside each lecture, there were of course practical homework assignments to implement the ideas we learned during the lecture. And those were again using PyTorch. Now, besides uni, I still had this boring physics lab job. At this point, I was working there for 2 to 2.5 years already. But the cool thing was, the research institute I worked at also had an AI department. So I wanted to internally switch teams. I applied, got an interview, and was rejected. I mean, I get it. I was just starting my first real ML course and had no theoretical knowledge of any of the ML fundamentals. So I tried again half a year later, after completing the ML course and having gathered more basic PyTorch experience. And then actually did get the job. What an amazing start to my second graduate semester, my second half of my 4th year. I started my work as an applied scientist, student researcher in the ML department. I again had a steep learning curve and was so excited to get to work. These first 6 months, I started working on a lot of data engineering, mainly using pandas, which I have never used before. I learned a lot there. And at uni, I also focused on purely practical learning. I took 2 project courses. I again continued to work on this robotics project, but at this point I felt a bit more of a fatigue working on the project. It wasn't that exciting anymore, but it still was a lot of work, and my learning curve plateaued. But I continued to work on it because I hoped for another paper. Nevertheless, I started to look at other cool ML domains and took another project course. A project on computer vision for medical image analysis. This was my first computer vision project, and I had to detect aneurysms in 3D images of the brain. It was really cool, but I have never dealt with computer vision before and had never learned what a convolutional neural network was. So the learning curve was again very steep. I had to learn all of that knowledge myself by watching YouTube videos and reading more papers. In the end, the final project was not the worst, but also not the best either. At least looking back at it now. And I think this is a good thing. If you are looking back at old projects and think they are bad and perhaps even cringing, because you would have done things differently with your current knowledge, then you have gotten better. So yeah, this year was packed with all the ML I could fit in. Most of it was actually working on ML projects and only taking one ML lecture, but a really important one. So far, it was quite straightforward, but in my next year, I had to make some important decisions. Now, uni continued as usual, but career-wise, I had to make those important decisions. In my third graduate semester, I again took one lecture course and 2 more projects. I took my first actual deep learning course, which had a decent overlap with my first ML course. I again learned about the same fundamentals of neural networks, but now also had lectures on CNNs, recurrent neural networks, autoencoders, and a bit of explainable AI. So nothing too crazy, right? At this point, I am really into AI myself, and I started watching paper review videos on YouTube and reading random papers on my own. Perhaps because this course didn't have too much new stuff, and my job didn't teach me much theoretical content as well. But anyway, this habit of reading papers and learning stuff on my own are things I still do to this day, and that I genuinely enjoy. So, besides this deep learning lecture, I once again worked on this robotics project. And I have to say, working on it this semester just wasn't necessary. It was really not that interesting anymore, and I really just wanted to learn new stuff. But I was still hoping for a paper, which in the end was never successfully published. Now, my second project course this semester, on the other hand, was again about reinforcement learning, but was amazing. I had to thoroughly read a paper and actually re-implement it and reproduce its results, which was a lot of fun. I often say it, and I'll say it again, re-implementing a paper and recreating its results is one of my favorite projects to recommend. I even wrote a blog post about it and submitted it to a Top ML Conference's blog post track. But I didn't really know how the process worked back then, and I did get my reviews, but never received an email telling me that they were released. So when I randomly checked, I saw the reviews and that I never responded to them. Thus, the article was rejected from the ICLR blog post track. Nevertheless, the project taught me a lot, and at this point, I was pretty confident I wanted to become a top ML researcher. And this goal meant for me I needed to strive for the best companies. My job at that time as a student researcher was not completely plateauing, but also not the best anymore. We started doing research on graph neural networks, but for over a year now, we were still stuck with a lot of the same boring data engineering and feature engineering. I effectively didn't really learn anything new. That's why I wanted to find a new job and not make the same mistake as before, where I stayed for 3 years at the same job. So I applied to dozens of top ML internships. And I actually got invited to an interview for an applied science internship at Amazon. That was my first real tech interview. It was really exciting. Except that I failed miserably. The more frustrating part was that the questions were really not that hard. It was a rapid-fire basic ML questions interview. They were literally asking about the content of my first ML course I mentioned before, the one I completed not even a year ago. But, well, life goes on, and I got another interview at a cool startup called Neuro. This time, it was for an ML engineering internship, and the first interview round was a coding interview. Again, something completely new to me. I prepared using LeetCode, but when I saw a blank coding canvas and no pre-existing code where I just had to fill in an algorithm, I was so scared. I failed miserably. Again. Well, the applications weren't going so well. I simply didn't get many more interviews. So I changed my approach. I directly reached out to a Google DeepMind researcher I found interesting and asked for an internship. And he got back to me. We had an interview call where I felt it went decently well. But I got rejected. I was done with looking for internships and focused on finding a new job as a student researcher, where I could also do my master's thesis. I decided I had enough of reinforcement learning and found computer vision really cool. But then I thought, how cool would it be if you could talk to an AI about images or even videos? Well, that's where I decided multimodal learning was really cool. But at my university, there was a problem. There were no professors working on multimodal learning, and pretty much all of the professors were, how do I say it, a bit more old school and not that much into the new stuff. There definitely were one or two, don't get me wrong, but they just weren't into something really similar to multimodal learning. So I looked outside of my uni, TU Berlin. I wanted to look for a professor that was a bit more active and ambitious. I read multimodal learning papers and looked at the authors. I then Googled them to see if they could be an option as an advisor for my research and thesis. And then I found the perfect professor. He was young, was just about to start as a professor, And before that, he was a postdoc at UC Berkeley and a researcher at Meta. And he worked on multimodal learning. He was everything I was looking for. Long story short, I am so happy to have gotten the job and started to work with him later in my final year. I still had my goal of getting to big tech, but there are these nice sayings: Rome wasn't built in a day, and all roads lead to Rome. i.e., everything takes time, and there are multiple ways to get where you want to get. So all in all, this semester, besides this career hassle, I just did a lot of coding. At my job, for the robotics project, and for this RL paper reimplementation. But this was still just the first half of my 5th year. My second half was not that eventful. Since I failed all my applications for summer internships, I was still doing my best to learn stuff at my, at the time, current job. Otherwise, not much interesting stuff happening there. And at uni, I really focused on computer vision. I took a course on automatic image analysis and another seminar course on deep learning for computer vision, where I had to read several papers on self-supervised learning and presented them to the group. That was so much fun. I just really enjoy reading papers. I even made my presentation into a mini YouTube series on self-supervised learning. But besides those 2 courses, I took my second general deep learning course. This one was finally a bit more advanced. I learned about things like representation learning, self-supervised learning, transformers, GANs, diffusion models, graph neural networks, and even neural ordinary differential equations. And finally, I also did another computer vision project course, where I wrote a paper/technical report on. So there was way more theoretical content this semester, but still a practical project. Now, you might have noticed that this semester usually should have been my final semester. Usually, the masters would end after 2 years, but I had actively decided to give myself 1 more year, mainly to have 1 semester for an internship and 1 more for my thesis. So this semester was my last one with courses, and since I didn't get an internship, I had 1 more entire year to focus on doing research with my new professor and then completing my master's thesis. And that is what I did in my final year. I was finally done with uni. At least it felt like that because I had no more exams. I started working as a student researcher with this cool professor and started doing research on multimodal learning, specifically video moment retrieval. I read a lot of papers, developed a model that achieved new state-of-the-art performance on the benchmarks I evaluated on, and wrote a paper on it in a very short time. I even submitted the paper to a top conference. And I'm telling you, those were some stressful weeks. But it still recently got rejected. And to be honest, I probably understand why. I rushed it because we chose a deadline that was simply way too close. I should have taken more time and just submitted it to a later conference, so that the paper was overall more solid. Although it was annoying, I will continue to improve this work and soon submit it to another conference. Then I remembered that I'm still in my final year. I still need to actually complete my degree, lol. That's why I'm currently still in the process of finishing to write my thesis and handing it in. But since this is my final year, I also had to think of what comes next. I thought to myself, either I skip the PhD and become a researcher at a top lab, or I do my PhD. I mean, how likely was it to skip the PhD? The cool thing was, I already had an offer from my professor for the PhD position, and I was very happy to accept it. Nevertheless, I still want to try out applying to 2 companies as a research scientist. One was DeepMind, and although I thought my chances were in fact decent, because I had exactly the combination of different experiences that they were looking for, I got rejected. But besides DeepMind, I applied for another really cool AI startup. My favorite one, to be precise. I knew I wouldn't even get invited to an interview. But one evening, I was like, why not? they won't invite me anyway. But you probably already know where I'm going with this. They did invite me, and I was shocked. The application process was quite tough, and I wanted to really give it my all and see if I am good enough for them. And well, long story short, I did get an offer and will work for them starting in a few months at the time of this recording. Once I start my work, I will announce which company it is, don't worry. I just want to make it cool because for me it is a big thing. But yeah, anyway, throughout all these years there was a lot of struggling, but also some occasional successes. I quickly learned that the important thing is to keep moving. Some people get to where I am now in less time and some in more, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that you try to improve every day by 1%, overall enjoy what you do, and that you are proud of what you do. Nevertheless, there are many mistakes you can avoid and not waste any time on if you simply know what they are. That's why you might want to watch this video next. I there share 7 common mistakes beginner ML students make every year. Happy learning and bye bye!